All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about capital budgeting and some of the reasons why we care about capital budgeting. So let's get into it a little bit. So one of the main reasons we care about capital budgeting, why it's relevant to us, is pretty much all fixed asset projects are going to involve capital budgeting, and some other things could use similar approaches as well. So let me give you some examples. If I'm buying a piece of machinery, capital budgeting. If I'm thinking about building a large facility, capital budgeting can come into play there. New fleet of delivery trucks, capital budgeting. Putting in a new fuel station for fueling delivery trucks, capital budgeting. So lots of kinds of things that a business would do involves capital budgeting. And generally, since we're looking at fixed asset projects, fixed assets are typically expensive for businesses, and they also typically have long lives. So if they're expensive, they've got long lives. What that basically means is we got lots of money involved, so potentially substantial investments are involved with the process. It's a long-lived assets. That means the effects of my choice are going to be with me for a long time to come. I'm going to be living with this choice for a while. And ultimately, that means that forecasts have to go years into the future because I'm looking at a project that lasts for years. So I got to think about what's happening between now and then and what the impact would be. And that means I'm going to have to plan for this. So I need to be thinking about what cash flows are going to be happening in which years and make sure I have adequate resources at the different points in time. If I have to schedule a maintenance overhaul, as a normal part of this project, 2 years, 3 years down the line, I need to make sure I'm thinking about how much is that going to cost? Do I have the resources necessary to do that and so forth? Now, just in general, when I start using long time horizons, there are a few issues that pop up. One of them being forecasting, right? We're making projections years in the future. And since we're making projections, we are going to be wrong. We don't know the future with certainty. And since we don't know the future with certainty, we are going to be wrong. It's just a matter of how much. Hopefully, we're not going to be wrong by too much, but we're going to be wrong to some extent because we don't know what the future is going to bring. So we're going to try to do the best job that we can to project what we think is going to happen. But keep in mind that the further out I go into the future, realistically, probably the less I really know about what's going to happen. And some projects are going to be worse in that regard than others. Also, something that's worth noting is managerial continuity. So if I have a manager who launches a project and then leaves for another job, gets fired, passes away, whatever, then somebody else steps into that person's shoes, and then it raises the question of, well, is that other person going to be handling this project the same way? Are they going to make different choices? How's that going to play out? And that may mean that I may have had a plan for how things are going to work out. New manager may come in, may make different choices. So that could actually kind of affect sort of how those forecasts actually play out in reality. And one of the things that you should look at is if we had to do forecasts for years into the future, we made choices, et cetera, based on that, doing a post-audit periodically is a good idea. And the basic idea behind a post-audit is you go back, you look at what decisions you made, why you made it, what your assumptions were, et cetera, and you kind of see how did things actually turn out. And does it look like things actually worked out the way that you would have expected, or maybe not so much? And so basically the thought is hopefully we can learn from that process and get better for the next time that we have to do a project. So that's the idea. Now, if you're thinking about these fixed asset investments, it's important to make sure that you're contemplating where is the company going. If you're thinking about buying facilities to manufacture a product, for instance, you don't want to spend a whole bunch of money on a project that is going to not fit with the company's long-term direction. In other words, if we conclude that the company ought to get out of a certain line of business, for instance, probably we shouldn't be spending a whole bunch of money expanding the capacity to produce more of that, right? So ultimately, when you're thinking about fixed asset kind of projects, what projects are consistent with the direction that the company's going? And I'll come back to that in a moment and address that in a little bit more detail. Also, it's worth noting as sort of a broad principle here, if interest rates are really low and the cost of capital as a whole is really low, longer term projects start looking more attractive. If you're thinking, well, why would that be? Well, basically, if the interest rates and cost of capital are low, the discount rate is low. And when I find present values of future cash flows, lower discount rates means higher present value. And all of a sudden, things look like they are more valuable. So that's something to kind of think about. When interest rates are low, longer term projects, hey, they look pretty good. And if cost of capital in general is low, again, longer term projects look better, right? And projects as a whole will look better, but the longer term ones are going to benefit more from that decline in the cost of capital and so forth. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of the definitions then. So some official definitions, and then kind of a little bit more about where some of the ideas, capital budgeting ideas come from and so forth. So capital budgeting is basically the process of analyzing projects and determining if they should be included in the firm's capital budget. So let's kind of back up a minute. Basically, companies have a limited amount of money available to spend on fixed assets. And if they've got a limited amount of money to spend on fixed assets, then from that perspective, basically we have to try to allocate this the most efficient way possible. And if we have to allocate this in the most efficient way possible, then I'm going to have to prioritize, right? And my goal is going to be to try to come up with the most profitable combination of projects possible within a given budget in order to maximize long-term shareholder wealth. So basically, if I've got $20 million to spend in a large corporation, I'm trying to spend that on projects that are going to give me the most return for the shareholders, so the most increase in shareholder wealth. So if I've got hundreds of possible projects, I'm trying to pick the combination of projects that uses my $20 million in the best possible way. So that's the idea. That's kind of our goal here. So really, at the end of the day, fundamentally, capital budgeting is all about the allocation of scarce resources. So we care an awful lot about scarce resources and using those as efficiently as possible. Now, given that I care about scarce resources and trying to use those efficiently, let's talk about where capital budgeting ideas come from and a little bit about kind of what they look like. So at the end of the day, capital budgeting ideas are fundamentally generated by the firm. In other words, the company has to come up with the ideas, right? So we have to figure out what should we be spending our money on. And that means it's going to depend upon this specific company, the circumstances the company's facing, et cetera. Now, as a broad principle, basically, those capital budgeting ideas need to be consistent with the firm's big picture strategic business plan. So when you're doing a strategic analysis, you're asking things like, where's the market headed? Where's the company headed kind of within what's going on in the market? And then as a result of that, what kind of projects are going to help that company pursue its strategy the most? So, think about what's happening from a demographic standpoint, what's happening in the general economic environment, in the general business environment, what's happening from a regulatory standpoint, what's happening for my industry, all these kinds of things. I'm trying to figure out what's happening in all those areas. And then given all of that and given what we as a company are good at, what are we going to be doing? What segment of the market are we targeting? Are we trying to produce certain types of products or services, et cetera? And once you figured out where the company needs to go, given what's happening in the environment around it, then it turns into, well, if I know where the company's going, what projects are going to help the company pursue it? And that's where we would get the list of projects that we would then have to sift through for our capital budget. So that's where capital budgeting ideas come from. Hopefully this little overview of kind of the general idea of what capital budgeting is and capital budgeting ideas, hopefully is helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.